Welcome to EconomicZ101, the podcast made for Gen Z by Gen Z, bridging the gap between economics, finance, current events in our generation with speakers Vish, Wretam, Sinan, and myself Mihir. Today, we're going to be talking about the Iraq War. Yes, the infamous war that took place over 18 years ago at this point. In the news for this past week, the Taliban has been raging in Afghanistan for demilitarization and destabilization, taking over major outposts, and UN outcalls are being made. The Middle East destabilization is only being put on a lens for further and further, even with terrorist groups gaining less prominence in the mainstream media. It's obvious that Western intervention in the Middle East has caused problems for years and years, and this isn't something that's new. America's imperialistic history has stayed for so long, since the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt, McKinley, pushing forward into Cuba, making different amendments and laws to push forward America into places, pushing forward the American doctrine of excellence. And that was the case in what happened in Iraq, pushing forward the idea of democracy. And it's really interesting to think about, right? By installing your own leader into a place and destabilizing them is America's vision for peace in the Middle East, which is essentially a rough spot for most of the world in the latter half of the 20th century. This all began with the 1991 Gulf War, with Iraq and Saddam Hussein, who was the leader at that point, creating issues in the Middle East and even hearing UN calls for suppression. With chemical weapons and dangerous defensive posts popping up, America and the Western world was considered to be the top for fighting against terrorism. And this case only grew and grew more and more. Today, we're going to do an overview on the Iraq War, the motives, the pretext for how it all went down, and the aftermath. We're going to begin with what happened before it and what was the overall impact.
I think it's pretty safe to say that the U.S. itself has a huge grasp when it came to the Iraqi War. In 2002-2003, President George, he cited the possibility of Saddam Hussein acquiring weapons. And these weapons are of both chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And the U.S., of course, was fearful of it. And who wouldn't? This access of weapons posed a huge threat towards the United States. And currently, with the Civil War, there's a threat to many citizens, including those who don't want to face the bloodshed. The citizens are in the crossfire between both sides. Both sides itself are the Iraqi armed forces, the Kurdish Peshmerga, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I'm so sorry for butchering that, and various Turkish Muslim, with the other side being the Armenian Christian forces, as well as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Currently, the Civil War itself is a threat to many. As mentioned before, the citizens of Iraq who don't want to face the bloodshed but are caught in crossfires through the U.S. sending their soldiers in, through suicide bombings, and so on.
The Iraq War, as you said, Wretam, was a time of intense violence and extreme bloodshed. And in establishing the pretext so we can do our due diligence to our audience, the Iraq War was a battle to displace Middle Eastern thought, pushing forward American supremacy in a way and establishing democracy. Neoconservative and GOP conversation in America established, let's get Saddam Hussein out of there as fast as possible. We need to put our own leader in so we can fix the issues. And what ended up happening was a lot worse. There's an editorial written by an Iraqi member who had witnessed the bloodshed firsthand, and he actually put forward his words in a memoir.
So I remember calling a New York Times article where someone wrote about their country being destroyed by America. I believe that the article itself read 15 years ago, America destroyed my company. He himself wrote a book later on, which I read recently, and it really described the harsh reality that the U.S. had when it came to Iraq. And I believe it was called Ajam in Iraq Raspidi. And it's a highly recommended read. What he describes throughout the entire story and about his current life in the article itself was basically the dictatorship that Saddam Hussein had. But of course, it was a horrible regime. But what he also began to describe is how the United States led a negative impact into it. What he did describe was how the U.S., even after Saddam Hussein's execution and arrest, there was still a lot of suicide bombings. There was still violence being there, and the U.S. did nothing. They believed that they saved them, yet there was a lot of damage that was done. And you see this today, that despite the fact that people like Bush was able to have all of these violent acts towards Iraq, he's still being shown in the Ellen DeGeneres show, talking about dancing and about paintings. And that just seemed very, very shameful.
Yeah, I think it's pretty ironic that the US came to Iraq just to try and bring peace, yet there was so much bloodshed that came out of all of this.
Now that we've established some sort of context for what happened in the beginning of the war and some anecdotes that provide a really emotional connection that showed what actually happened, we can establish a timeline for the Iraq War, beginning with in 2003 and how mission was accomplished and Bush announced U.S. forces have begun a military operation into Iraq. This was the beginning for everything, and it set a militaristic precedence for the future.
I mean, yeah, after Bush declared this declaration of war against Iraq, there was a lot of warfare happening. Almost immediately, U.S. and British already overpowered Iraqi forces. And then just a few months down the ladder in August, right, there was a suicide bomber that infiltrated UN headquarters in Iraq and destroyed Sergio Vieira de Mello, right? He was a UN special representative to Iraq, right? And immediately after this, the UN, they had to withdraw all their non-essential employees, right? So it just goes to show how things drastically escalated from one declaration of war.
In the future, a few months after that, Saddam Hussein ended up being captured from his main hole in Tikrit. And in the months that happened after that, militaristic intent just started to spiral more and more. And American and Western forces started to gain extreme precedence in the area, killing more and more Iraqi people. In April, Abu Ghraib, who was common to be the beginning in Al-Qaeda, was evidence of prisoner abuse in the US-run prison. And this only showed more sentiment for violence in the area. Even though war crimes were obviously pushed by the UN and obviously outlined, so much was going wrong so fast. And that was only furthered in 2006 when Saddam Hussein was executed at the end of the year. It was a major event. After all, in the beginning of the 1990s, Saddam Hussein's conflict with the Western world started, and 15 years later, it ended in his own country.
One thing that we can take a positive look out of was that during the Obama presidency, once he was elected in November 4, 2008, his promise to remove U.S. troops from Iraq was slowly being taken in place. Despite the fact that there's still U.S. troops currently deployed, there was a lot that were still able to be removed from the U.S. itself and from Iraq itself. And because of Obama, he was able to do that in the span of a few weeks.
I mean, in the years afterwards, what ended up happening is more information started coming out against the war in Iraq, and President Bush's approval rating tanked to the lowest in any president in over 100 years. The GOP and the Republican Party started to distance itself from the mistakes done in Iraq, with over 100,000 Iraqi people dying and 4,500 Americans dying in battle. And remember, these Iraqi people, these are not all militants. These are not people fighting against the U.S. military. These are innocent people as well, which only heightens the crimes of what happened. We have to hold our government accountable for the war crimes that were done. And in future years, evidence was shown that whistleblowers and people who had given evidence and outlook to the American government had lied about the entire thing to instigate the process. Yes, this 8-year-long war was only held up by a lie. And it begs the question, did America really go to war to try to silence Saddam Hussein and bring peace to the area? Or were there other motives in check? How did Bush engage America to go to war?
Yeah, obviously, there is a lot of different consensus around whether America should have gone to war or not. But as we just here spoke about, President Bush needs to be held accountable, right? There's innocent lives being taken for silly reasons that weren't even released to the public until further findings, right? So there's one particular method that President Bush, he used to have America unanimously support the war. So he actually pushed forward this neoconservative ideology. Remember, neoconservatives, pro-war, military, everything, right? So he made this an official doctrine where, quote, "It is a policy of the United States to seek and support growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world." That essentially translates to, okay, let's eradicate another nation's leader and replace him with a democratic leader, right? Doesn't that sound kind of like modern day imperialism, right? We've seen what happened with Cuba, where they executed their own. They didn't execute; they removed their leader and replaced it with a U.S. leader. And yeah, you've seen what happened there. So this is his way of justifying how attacking Saddam Hussein and removing him from dictatorship in Iraq.
And that begs the question: what were the real reasons to get into war? And to begin that, it was consensus in American thought and Western idea of the Middle East that Iraq was a state sponsor of terrorism. While there are some holes in this, it was mostly true, as it's no surprise that the terror events for 9/11 had an impact on the decision making behind the US invading Iraq. Signed in January of 2002, the US said they wouldn't differentiate terrorist groups that harbor weapons of mass destruction. And that was the main justification for the Bush administration going into Iraq. Finding that Iraq was making these weapons of mass destruction that they had previously said they weren't, and using tips from Iraqi people that escaped to different countries, they went after it. Obviously, this was later proven to be false, and no weapons of mass destructions were found. It was shown how many holes were in the Bush strategy. By removing Hussein from his regime, it was a demonstration of the US military might. And this goes back to neoconservative thought, pushing your military, pushing the idea that America is number one and they're saving the region in the Middle East. And this falls back onto weapons of mass destruction overall.
Another big reason that the US wanted to go to war was because they thought that Iraq still harbored these weapons of mass destruction, right? We saw how in 2001, 9/11, they demonstrated how the Muslim Middle Eastern nations, they potentially harbored weapons of mass destruction, right? And obviously the US saw this as a threat to themselves and they wanted to take action, right? So one way they wanted to push forward this consensus was to have Iraq as a prime target. I mean, Iraq, they've been known to, even though the UN has told them to not use any weapons of mass destruction in warfare, they still went ahead. Obviously, in 1980, with Iraq versus Iran, they've used things like mustard gas, other types of biological nuclear weapons that were typically banned, right? And following these events, right, they at some point in time, they found there was a loophole in the UN's policies where they were able to create more weapons of mass destruction, but for quote unquote protection. I mean, obviously, I don't believe this is true. They just wanted to make more weapons of mass destruction that they could threaten other nations with. But eventually, they did have to give up these to the UN later after this loophole was fixed. And the US's Operation Desert Fox destroyed any remaining infrastructure of nuclear weapons.
This was further shown in conservative thought in America, thinking that Iraq hid more weapons even after it was proven that they didn't. Bush pointed out in his speech to the nation, quote, "better safe than sorry for these policies," and quote, and then keeping this example for Iraq's non-cooperation in the UN, let's foster it, go to war, and try to prevent Middle Eastern corruption. This brings the question, is there a domino effect happening?
I mean, the unofficial reason why the US led the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was that they needed to make an example and strike a massive blow demonstrating America's military power. And by doing this, the neoconservatives in the US also sought to intimidate other nations from harboring terrorists by waging a campaign of dominance and sending a clear signal that any country that decided to pose as a threat could be next and face the same fate that Iraq was facing. And they hoped that following this, other Middle Eastern dictators would just comply with the US instead of what Saddam Hussein was doing, and just make things a lot easier for the US when they're really just looking out for their own interests.
I think one key term we should be looking at also is what neoconservatism really is. So what, obviously a lot of people have heard about conservatism, but specifically what neoconservatism does, it emphasizes both military plus intervention. So they would idealize like Bush's attempts towards Iraq and so on. I hope that made more sense.
And that begs the question, the real reasons Bush went to war. Obviously, we've outlined the mistakes of Bush's false hope of finding weapons of mass destruction and being tipped off incorrectly by false information. This was largely an issue on America and a failure of American intelligence, which cost 100,000 Iraqi lives and 4,500 American lives. But what was the reason they wanted to go through with it? Oil. Oil was the reason.
We've seen all the memes. We've seen all of that. U.S. will probably do anything for oil. And this is one big example of that. Hussein controlled the country, controlled the Iraq country, which is at the center of the Gulf. And because of that, that hosted a quarter of the world's oil production in 2003. And because of that, the U.S. wanted some action. So because of all of these violent actions towards this, they were able to transport oil from Iraq all the way to the U.S., which caused massive economic status for the U.S.
And this is only shown by Rumsfeld, right, Sinan?
Yeah, these dudes, they made the wackiest cover-ups like you could ever think of. Like, I know they wanted to make Donald Rumsfeld, he wanted to make it known to the U.S. that they didn't want to go to war because they didn't want to make it so simple, like because of oil, right? Donald Rumsfeld, he literally said, we won't take forces and go around the world and try to take other people's oil. I mean, what happened after that, right? They literally went around trying to take the oil, right? And then even after the war, some people, they were saying like, there is no way that if oil was an issue, there would have been an infinitely easier deal with Saddam, right? They're saying that like if oil was the real issue, they could have just made a deal with Saddam and end with that. And obviously that didn't happen, right? So the line of reasoning is that oil wasn't the main reason here, but obviously we know that's fake.
I mean, what's even crazier is that the consensus around the early 2000s said, hey, Bush, Blair, Rumsfeld, they're all brilliant strategists whose actions will improve the security for our country. We should look at them as an international beacon for success. I mean, what a load of crap. We have a term for this in current year, right? It's called coping. And that's what the GOP and the Republican Party did after the failure of the Iraq War. Another reason for this was money, right? At the beginning of every war, trying to push forward your agenda and trying to save your dollar. And that's exactly what the dollar preservation for the Iraq War was.
Right. This is not known to many people, but one of the main reasons aside from oil for going into war was because of dollar preservation. So if you don't know what that is, in the 1970s, the US, they agreed with Saudi Arabia that OPEC oil will be traded in dollars, right? So they'll give the US oil and instead they'll get dollar bills for it, right? And because of this, American governments, they've had a reason to print more dollar bills, right? And cover like huge trading deficits, right? And with these extra printed bills, they're able to throw it in the US money markets, right? So it's a win-win. But then as of 2004, right, the US deficit with the world was around $2.7 trillion, right? Obviously they owe the world that much money, right? And because of this, Saddam Hussein, he decided that, let's not trade with dollars anymore. Let's go with the euros instead, European euros. So because of this, like the US was pretty shocked, right? Because they already had a huge deficit, right? And if Saddam Hussein agreed to go with trading for euros instead, right, the price of the dollar bill, it would plummet significantly, right? This is called a plummeting dollar, where basically, I think nowadays, €1 is worth $1.25, around that. But if they were to go ahead with trading oil with euros, it probably would have been €1 for $2, right? It would devalue the whole American economy as a whole, right? So and obviously because of this, Bush placed Iran and Iraq on the evil axis, quote, from this point forward to try and make sure that this switch from dollars to euros would not happen.
And that poses the further question that there's tons of ulterior motives present in war. I mean, what's common in militaristic intent in America and through its history is there's always something going on behind the covers. And that was proved in the last 5 years for the Iraq War. And that ultimately asked the question, should we have gone to war? What I think, absolutely not. Over 100,000 people dying, man. So many innocent lives to false information because of neoconservative thought in this country. And the aftermath of this war is truly scary.
Yeah, especially with the amount of people, like you said, the amount of casualties there were, and the way the US attacked Iraq was very cruel, because they not only attacked the people they were fighting, but the civilians who were there as well, because they destroyed the entire Iraqi economy by getting rid of all the oil that was there and basically sending missiles to destroy oil plants as well. And then they also attacked water plants and electric plants to make it impossible for the people they were fighting to get resources. But this in turn affected all the civilians who were living there as well, and they were forced to go to other countries as refugees.
I mean, that's absolutely right. And it provides further context for why the war is essentially disingenuous and it was a complete failure. If you look, there's so many reasons why this was a complete ego step on the part of America. And that could be seen in the way that America handled Saddam Hussein and his behavior.
I mean, you can tell that for one of the primary reasons for the war was that the advocating of it for Saddam Hussein was that it was too dangerous to handle these weapons. And then for once, he can't be contained. However, the US's ability to contain Russia, as one past example during the Cold War, shows that this is definitely not true. Americans accused Saddam Hussein of having a reckless plan, but his plans to take control over the Persian Gulf were all calculated. And his conflicts with the Shah of Iran were also calculated as well. The US itself had a decisive plan, and similar to the Cold War, you can tell that Saddam Hussein's plans were a lot more calculated.
And that's why I said earlier, this was an ego overstep. Obviously, there are issues with totalitarian leaders in the Middle East, but completely destabilizing a nation, taking out their leg economically, taking out their leg socially, taking out their leader, it only creates room for more issues, and this was seen in the massive amounts of bloodshed. And this further quantifies and elaborates on why imperialism, especially in an age of technology, is really disgusting and hurtful.
Yeah, like Sinan was talking about before, the whole neoconservative ideology is so flawed that the US has to step in for other countries' affairs. And imperialism in the past has always been terrible for the countries that have been colonized. And that was also seen here. Even though the US wasn't necessarily trying to colonize Iraq, they basically were trying to take over their government. And it destroyed the lives of all the civilians that were involved there. Because, like I said before, the way they were attacking the soldiers of Iraq was affecting everyone that was involved.
I mean, it's really sad, right? Imperialism, they also force one country's ideology into another, a neoconservative mindset, right? That dictatorship should be replaced with democracy. It just gives off the idea that America's ideology is always better than another country's. We've also seen how imperialism has destroyed Iraq's economy since the attack on Iraq. And since this attack also destroyed many sources of oil that the US targeted, the trade of oil was 90% of Iraq's economy, right? And now it's gone. We've seen how imperialism has negatively affected different nations in the past, even the US itself.
I think something you can take away from this is that despite America's good intentions, there's always some hidden agenda. For this case, we could see that it was oil. And I think one thing we should learn from this is that through the different actions that US causes for the future, we should be able to see the hidden agendas behind it.
I mean, obviously, we lead a progressive podcast, and part of the reason we came together and started this thing now on our 11th edition, we want to inform, especially concerning to our generation, as political agendas are becoming more prominent, but misinformation also is. And in starting this podcast, we want to put our ideas out there and try to inform as much as we can for what happened in the past. We're really passionate about what we're doing right now, and we're really happy you guys are enjoying the content. Today, we covered the Iraq War. Obviously, a little more past topic than we've done in the bit, but we're going to be covering minimum wage soon, talking about how America should improve its basic income pay and try to improve econ in general. Thank you guys for coming in today, as always, and we'll see you guys very, very soon. Bye.
Later.
See you guys.